My name is Matthew Carter, owner of a coffee chain worth millions, but at my brother's wedding I was just the cheap one in their eyes. They laughed at my suit, whispered that I belonged at a $15 buffet, not in a ballroom like this. What no one knew was that every rose, every drop of champagne, every note of music tonight, I paid for it all. $165,000 wired in secret. And when the officiant took the mic, the truth hit the room like a thunderclap. The moment I stepped into the grand ballroom of the Starlight Manor, the warmth of golden chandeliers and the soft hum of a live string quartet wrapped around me. The moment I stepped into the grand ballroom of the Starlight Manor, the warmth of golden chandeliers and the soft hum of a live string quartet wrapped around me. The scent of roses and white lilies filled the air, mingling with the faint aroma of champagne. My polished shoes sank slightly into the plush cream carpet as I moved past the towering floral arrangements that flanked the entrance. Eyes followed me almost immediately. I could feel them before I saw them, that subtle shift in conversation, the quick darting glances that assessed my navy suit and plain tie. Off to the left, near the dessert table draped in satin, Samantha Hayes stood in a shimmering silver gown that caught the light like a blade. Her smile when she noticed me was polite enough for the crowd, but her eyes flicked up and down, lingering just a beat too long on my off-the-rack jacket. She turned to the woman beside her, whispering something that earned a knowing laugh. My gaze moved past them without pause, my expression steady, though a flicker of heat curled in my chest. As I made my way deeper into the room, snippets of conversation floated toward me. From a table near the dance floor, a voice low but not low enough said, "He looks like he's headed to the $15 buffet at the mall." Another chuckle followed, muffled behind a glass of wine. My jaw tightened for the briefest moment before I loosened it again, slipping on the practiced calm I'd worn for years. The band shifted into a smooth jazz number and I headed toward the bar, nodding at a few distant cousins I hadn't seen in years. Their smiles were brittle, the kind you wear when you don't quite remember someone but know you should. I could still feel Samantha's gaze on my back, sharp and assessing. It had been that way since the day Ryan introduced us years ago. At the bar, the bartender, a young guy with neatly rolled sleeves, asked what I'd like. I ordered a club soda with lime, feeling no need to start with anything stronger. As I waited, my eyes swept the room. Ryan, in his tailored tuxedo, stood near the head table laughing with a group of his colleagues from the engineering firm. His hand rested on Samantha's back, the two of them, the picture of the perfect couple hosting the perfect wedding. Their guests looked at them like they were royalty, every detail here screaming luxury, every corner photogenic. I took a sip of my drink and let my gaze wander to the towering cake at the far end of the room. The cascading sugar flowers matching the arrangements along the walls. The place settings gleamed under the chandeliers, each one precise, deliberate, expensive. A string of servers moved gracefully through the crowd, with trays of canapes, their black and white uniforms crisp against the warm tones of the room. A pair of my father's old friends passed by, clapping me lightly on the shoulder, asking the usual questions about Portland. "Still running that coffee shop," one of them said, with an indulgent smile, as though it were a quirky little hobby I'd picked up to pass the time. I gave the same polite answer I always did, that business was steady and life was good. From across the room I caught my father's eyes. William Carter stood near the entrance to the veranda, his suit perfectly pressed, his expression unreadable. He gave me a small nod, neither warm nor cold, before turning back to the man beside him. My mother, Helen, was somewhere in the crowd, no doubt making small talk and ensuring every guest felt welcomed as she always did. As the music swelled and laughter rippled through the room, I felt the weight of the moment pressing in. No one here knew, not a single one of them, the truth about this evening. They saw me as they always had the younger brother who'd stepped away from the corporate ladder, the one who dressed simply and kept to himself. I let their perceptions sit between us like an invisible barrier, one I had no desire to break. Not yet. I moved away from the bar, weaving through the clusters of guests. The scent of the prime rib being carved at the buffet line reached me rich and mouth-watering. A bridesmaid in blush pink brushed past, murmuring an apology, her arms full of empty champagne flutes. I glanced toward the head table again, watching Samantha lean into Ryan, her lips moving in a whisper that made him laugh. I let my gaze drift to the balcony doors, the night beyond them cool and still under a sky just beginning to gather Somewhere outside, the sound of the city's evening traffic hummed faintly, a distant reminder that life went on beyond these walls. Inside, the wedding unfolded in perfect choreography, each moment polished and rehearsed. If only they knew, I thought, the quiet certainty settling in my chest. Everything they were celebrating tonight, every shimmering light, every note of music, every bite of food existed because of me. In the spring of 2015, I was sitting at my desk on the 22nd floor of a glass tower in downtown Seattle, staring at a half-finished marketing pitch and wondering why my chest felt so tight. Outside, the city buzzed beneath a blanket of gray clouds, ferries cutting across the sound like tiny white arrows. Inside, the air hummed with the tapping of keyboards and the low murmur of voices trying to sound more confident than they felt. Westbrook and Vale was the kind of place people fought to get into. Fresh out of college, I had been proud to land a spot there. The salary was good, the benefits even better, but the shine had worn off fast. Every week was another impossible deadline, another competition disguised as collaboration. Greg Hamilton, my manager, had a way of leaning over my shoulder to skim my work, his tone casual but sharp enough to cut. "Not bad, Matt, but we can have someone polish this." I used to nod, pretending not to notice the smirk in his voice. The breaking point came in a glass-walled conference room on a Thursday morning. I had poured 2 weeks into a pitch for a major tech client, working nights and skipping weekends. I handed the packet to Greg, barely getting through the first slide before he interrupted. "This is safe. Safe doesn't win accounts." A couple of my co-workers chuckled, their eyes sliding away when I glanced at them. My throat felt dry, my palms damp against the table. I finished the meeting, but I knew before I walked out that I was done. That night in my small apartment with the sound of rain against the windows, I sat staring at a blank screen. I wasn't thinking about my next job. I was thinking about how much I hated selling things I didn't believe in. I thought about the cafes I loved, the kind where the air smelled of fresh beans and cinnamon, where people lingered over mugs and conversations instead of rushing to the next thing. Somewhere between exhaustion and longing, the idea settled in my mind and refused to leave. I would open my own place, telling my family was harder than quitting. I drove down to Eugene that weekend, the streets lined with early spring blossoms, and walked into the kitchen where my parents were sitting. My dad, Richard Carter, was at the table with the newspaper folded beside his coffee. My mom, Elaine, was stirring a pot of soup on the stove. I told them I was leaving Westbrook and Vale, that I was moving to Portland to open a coffee shop. My father's mug hit the table a little too hard. "You're walking away from a steady paycheck to pour coffee. You've got benefits, a retirement plan. You think passion pays the bills." He looked at me like I'd just confessed to burning down the family home. My mother kept stirring her back to me, but I caught her eyes in the reflection of the microwave door. They were filled with worry. I tried to explain that I wasn't happy, that I wanted something of my own, that I needed to build something I could be proud of. My father shook his head slowly. "You're throwing away your future. You'll regret it." The rest of dinner passed in a fog of small talk, but the weight of his disapproval hung over everything. 2 weeks later, I was hauling boxes into a small one-bedroom apartment in northeast Portland. The floors were uneven, the windows rattled when buses went by, but it felt like possibility. I spent days walking neighborhoods, talking to shop owners, and sketching ideas in a worn leather notebook. I learned the smell of freshly ground beans at local roasters, how different water temperatures brought out different notes in the coffee. By July, I had signed a lease on a narrow brick storefront on Alberta Street. The old florist who'd been there before left behind faint traces of eucalyptus in the air. I painted the walls a warm cream, found second-hand tables, and bought an espresso machine from a cafe that had closed downtown. Every evening I left with paint in my hair and dust on my clothes, but my chest felt lighter than it had in years. Opening day was cold and drizzly, the kind of Portland morning where the sky hangs low and silver. I flipped the sign to open and stood behind the counter, the steam wand hissing as I frothed milk for my first customer. A middle-aged man in a wool cap told me it felt like a place that had been here forever. By noon, a few more curious neighbors had wandered in. I went home that night smelling of coffee and rain, and for the first time in years, I didn't dread the morning. Calls to my family stayed polite. My mom would ask how business was going. My dad would make a neutral noise, and the conversation would drift back to my brother Ryan's promotion or Samantha's latest vacation. I told myself it didn't matter, that I wasn't doing this for their approval, but some nights I'd lie in bed and hear my father's voice in my head, reminding me that I was on my own. By fall, the trees on Alberta Street had turned to fire, and I had regular customers who knew my name and their drink order. I learned who liked oat milk, who needed an extra shot, who was going through a divorce, and who was finally getting married after 20 years together. It wasn't the life I'd left behind in Seattle, but it was mine. And for now, that was enough. By early 2018, Maple and Sage had grown into something I could be proud of. The first shop on Alberta Street had a steady flow of regulars, and the second location in the Pearl District was already turning a profit. I had been thinking about expanding outside of Portland, and Austin kept coming up in conversations with roasters and suppliers. The city had a vibrant coffee scene, but there was room for something with our style. Ryan was the first person I thought to approach. My older brother had always been sharp with numbers and business deals, and he had money to invest from his work in real estate. I figured if we could partner, he could handle the property side while I focused on operations and branding. We met at a steakhouse in downtown Dallas while I was in town visiting. The place had dark wood paneling and low lighting, the kind of place where the waiters wore crisp white shirts and addressed you as sir. Ryan arrived in a tailored suit, Samantha trailing a step behind in a fitted dress and heels that clicked against the hardwood. Over dinner, I laid it out for him. The Austin location, the growth numbers from Portland, the projections for the first year. I told him I wanted him in as a partner, not just an investor. He swirled his whiskey, glanced at the numbers, and smirked. I don't want to put money into some hipster coffee shop where people pay $5 for a latte, he said, leaning back in his chair. Samantha laughed lightly and added, "In Dallas, people drink champagne, not lattes." Her tone was light, but her eyes held that same sharp edge I had seen at family holidays. I felt the muscles in my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice steady. "It's not about the latte, Ryan. It's about building a brand people connect with, a space that draws the community in." He waved a hand as if brushing away a fly. "I'm not interested. There's no real money in coffee unless you're Starbucks, and you're not Starbucks." The rest of the dinner slid into small talk, but the air between us was colder. Samantha steered the conversation toward a charity gala they were attending, describing the champagne list in detail as if to underline her earlier point. Back in my hotel room that night, I went over the numbers again. They were solid. I knew the Austin location could work even without Ryan's money. His refusal wasn't about the numbers. It was about the way he saw me, the way he had always seen me as the younger brother chasing hobbies instead of building a career worth respecting. I flew back to Portland and threw myself into work. I tightened operations, trained a new manager for the Pearl District store, and started looking for investors who actually understood the value of what we were building. By the end of the year, I had secured funding from a group out of San Francisco who specialized in independent hospitality brands. The Austin shop opened the following summer in a converted warehouse with exposed brick and tall windows that flooded the space with light. On the first day, the line stretched out the door and the hum of conversation filled the air. I walked the floor handing out samples of our house blend, watching people settle into the space like they belonged there. Ryan didn't send flowers, didn't call. I saw Samantha post photos from a rooftop party in Miami that same week, champagne flutes glinting in the sunset. I didn't comment, didn't reach out. Instead, I focused on the people in front of me, the customers who had chosen to spend their time and money with us. The success of Austin didn't change the distance between me and my brother. If anything, it made it more pronounced. At family gatherings, he would ask polite questions about the business, his tone flat, his attention drifting before I could answer fully. Samantha would smile, tilt her head, and say something like, "I'm glad it's working for you, Matthew," in the same tone you'd use to talk about someone's vegetable garden. I stopped trying to prove anything to them. The numbers spoke for themselves, and the steady growth of the brand was all the validation I needed. But there was a part of me, quiet and buried, that still remembered the smirk in Ryan's eyes that night in Dallas. It was the part of me that knew one day the tables might turn. That thought stayed tucked away as the years rolled on. The shops multiplied and my life filled with early mornings, roasting sessions, and the endless rhythm of managing a growing business. I had no idea then that a single wedding invitation would set the stage for all of it to come back sharper than ever. By the start of 2024, Maple and Sage had grown into something even I could hardly believe. 5 locations, each distinct but carrying the same warmth, the same quiet hum of conversation over coffee. The annual revenue had crossed $4.5 million. But more important than the number was the feeling of walking into any of the shops and seeing familiar faces behind the counter. People who cared about what we were building. That spring, I closed on a 2-story Craftsman in the Irvington neighborhood of Portland. It wasn't flashy, but it had a wide front porch, big windows, and an old oak tree in the yard that shaded the house in summer. The place felt steady in a way I hadn't felt in years. I kept the purchase quiet, told only a few close friends. My family didn't ask, so I didn't tell. One of the people who did know was Tommy Nguyen, a 22-year-old barista who had started with me right after high school. He had a sharp mind for details and a work ethic that reminded me of myself at his age. When he told me he wanted to take night classes in business, I covered part of his tuition without telling him until the paperwork was done. He tried to refuse at first, but I just handed him a set of textbooks and told him it was non-refundable. Despite the growth and the stability I had built, the gap between me and my family seemed to widen with every passing year. When we did gather, the conversations tilted toward Ryan's latest real estate deal or Samantha's trips to Napa or Paris. If they asked about Maple and Sage at all, it was in a quick passing way, as if it were a hobby I was still dabbling in. I remember one Sunday dinner at my parents' house in Eugene. Ryan was recounting how a developer had flown him to Miami to look at a property, and Samantha was scrolling through her phone to show my mother pictures of their villa. I mentioned that our 5th location had just opened in Bend and was already outperforming projections. My father nodded without looking up from his plate, and my mother smiled politely before turning back to Samantha. It didn't hurt in the same way it used to. Somewhere along the way, I had learned to stop expecting their attention. But there was still a quiet sting in realizing that no matter what I built, I would always be the younger son who didn't follow the right path. In May, we launched a new seasonal blend, and I spent 2 weeks traveling between all 5 locations, training staff and fine-tuning the brew. Tommy ran the Alberta shop in my absence without a hitch. And Olivia Grant, my closest friend and my attorney, managed a thorny lease renewal in Austin that could have cost us thousands. These were the people who saw me, who knew the work behind every milestone. One afternoon, as I was closing up the Pearl District shop, I got a text from my mother. "Ryan and Samantha are engaged. Wedding next spring in Austin. Hope you can make it." There was no mention of me being involved in the planning, no question about my schedule, just an assumption I would be there. I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. Later that night, over drinks at a quiet bar, I mentioned the wedding to Olivia. She raised an eyebrow and asked if I was ready to spend a weekend surrounded by champagne toasts and polite jabs about my little coffee business. I laughed, but she wasn't wrong. It wasn't that I dreaded seeing them. It was that I knew exactly how I would be seen. Still, I pushed the thought aside. The wedding was months away, and there was plenty to do before then. The shops were thriving, my team was strong, and for the most part, my life felt solid. Whatever happened in Austin, I told myself I could handle it. I didn't know then that the invitation wasn't just to a wedding. It was an unspoken challenge, one that would pull every quiet resentment, every buried memory into the light. And for the first time in years, I would have the chance to decide how the story ended. It was early January, the kind of cold in Portland that seeps into your bones even when the rain isn't falling. Olivia and I were sitting in our usual corner booth at a little wine bar on Division Street, the one with the mismatched chairs and candles that burned low in cloudy glass jars. She had just come from court, her hair pulled back tight, her phone face down on the table like she was giving herself permission to unplug for an hour. Halfway through a glass of Pinot Noir, she leaned forward and said she had heard something interesting from a client in Austin. Apparently, Ryan and Samantha's wedding plans were bigger than I realized. A full weekend of events, a high-end venue on the outskirts of the city catering from one of the top chefs in Texas. And she added with a tilt of her head, they were already stretched thin trying to cover the costs. I asked how she knew, and she shrugged. The wedding planner, Grace Miller, was a mutual acquaintance. Grace had mentioned they were quietly looking for sponsors for some of the more extravagant elements. Olivia watched me closely like she already knew what I might be thinking. The idea came to me slowly at first, curling around in my mind as I swirled the wine in my glass. I could pay for it all. The venue, the catering, the flowers, the music. Every shimmering detail they wanted to show off, and no one would have to know, at least not right away. I pictured Ryan confident and polished, walking through the reception thinking he had pulled it off, and Samantha holding court in some glittering gown. I thought about every dinner where they had dismissed me, every smirk, every sideways comment about my little coffee business. And then I imagined the moment when the truth would come out. Olivia raised an eyebrow. "You're smiling in a way that makes me nervous." I told her the plan. She didn't flinch, just sat back and considered it like she was reviewing a legal brief. "You'd want absolute confidentiality," she said finally. "That means contracts, non-disclosure clauses, payments routed in a way that doesn't trace back to you until you want it to." We spent the next hour mapping it out. Olivia would draft the paperwork. Grace would be the intermediary, the only person on the wedding team who knew the source of the funds. I would transfer the money directly to her, and she would pay the vendors. A week later, we were in Grace's office in Austin, a bright space with floor-to-ceiling windows and white orchids on the desk. She was warm but professional, her handshake firm. When Olivia explained the arrangement, Grace's eyes widened for a moment, then she nodded. She assured me she could keep the secret. The number was higher than I expected. $165,000 to cover the venue catering, floral arrangements, live band lighting, and a few other extras Samantha had insisted on. I wired the money that afternoon from a quiet corner of a coffee shop in East Austin, watching the numbers shift on my phone screen. Tommy, who had flown down with me to scout a potential location for another maple and sage shop, noticed the look on my face. "Big purchase?" he asked, half joking. "Something like that," I said, and left it there. Over the next few weeks, the arrangements took shape. Grace sent me updates in careful, non-specific language, never naming me in any emails. Olivia kept the paperwork tight, making sure there were no loose ends. Meanwhile, Samantha was all over social media, posting about dress fittings and menu tastings, telling friends in comments that they were footing the bill themselves. One evening, I came across a video she had posted from a floral design session. She was holding a champagne flute, laughing with the florist, and in the background I caught Grace's profile as she adjusted a centerpiece. I wondered if she felt the same strange satisfaction I did, knowing the truth beneath the performance. I didn't tell anyone else. Not my parents, not my staff, not even the friends who might have understood. It wasn't about bragging or even about the money. It was about the control, the knowledge that for once, I was setting the stage instead of being a bystander. The wedding date crept closer each week, bringing another round of updates from Grace. Guest lists were finalized, menu tastings approved, the band booked. The more I heard, the calmer I felt. The pieces were in place. All that was left was to show up and wait. What I didn't know was that no plan, no matter how carefully laid, ever goes exactly the way you imagine. The wire transfer went through on a quiet Tuesday morning. I was in my office above the Alberta shop, the smell of roasted beans drifting up from below, when the confirmation email appeared on my screen. $165,000 gone from my account and into Grace's hands. It felt strange to move that much money without anyone around me knowing. Tommy was the only one I let in on a small piece of the plan, though even he didn't know the whole story. I told him I wanted something special for a dessert coffee bar at an event in Austin, and his eyes lit up. Within a week, he had samples from a roaster in Vermont and a small batch producer in California lined up for me to taste. We settled on a dark chocolate espresso blend that was rich without being bitter, the kind of drink you remembered long after the cup was empty. Grace kept the updates coming, each one more detailed than the last. The venue had been booked, a sprawling hill country estate with stone archways and a view of the sunset. The caterer finalized a menu that read like something like a food magazine. The florist had reserved thousands of white roses and hydrangeas. Every time I saw the photos she sent, I knew the day would look exactly like the kind of wedding Samantha dreamed of. In the meantime, life outside the plan went on. The shops were busy, winter blends were selling well, and I was finalizing the lease for a new location in Tacoma. But every so often, something from Austin would land in my lap uninvited. One afternoon, a photo of Samantha in a bridal boutique appeared in my social media feed, tagged by a mutual friend. She was standing on a pedestal in a beaded gown, one hand on her hip, grinning like the room belonged to her. The first real test came at an engagement party they threw at a rooftop bar downtown. I showed up in a navy suit, the same one I'd worn to a dozen business meetings, and kept mostly to the edges of the crowd. At one point, I found myself near Samantha and a group of her friends. She was telling them about the wedding, tossing out details about the imported champagne and the 7-piece band. Then she glanced in my direction just long enough for me to know the next line was meant for me. Good thing Matt will probably keep his gift small so it doesn't look too out of place next to the others. Her friends laughed sharp and quick like they'd been handed a joke they didn't have to think about. I smiled back, gave a polite nod, and sipped my drink. The heat that rose in my chest wasn't from embarrassment. It was something colder, a reminder of why I was doing all of this in the first place. Olivia caught up with me later on the terrace, her coat pulled tight against the wind. She didn't ask what had happened, but her eyes flicked toward the group still laughing at the bar. "You sure you're ready to keep quiet until the big day?" she asked. I told her I'd waited years for certain moments and a few more weeks wouldn't hurt. As the wedding date drew closer, Grace's tone shifted in her emails. The excitement was there, but so was the strain of keeping the secret. She told me Samantha was in full Queen of the Castle mode, dictating every tiny decision to the staff, while Ryan mostly stayed out of the way. Grace was good at hiding her frustration, but I could tell the act was wearing on her. Tommy shipped the coffee beans down 2 weeks ahead of the wedding, and I arranged for a barista team from our Austin shop to handle the service. Everything was in motion, the kind of behind-the-scenes coordination that would make the night seamless. Then came a text from my mother a week before the wedding. "We're all meeting for dinner the night before at the hotel. Ryan says he hopes you won't be too tired from your flight." It read like an afterthought, like I was another guest instead of someone who had just paid for the entire celebration. I typed out a reply, deleted it, and put my phone away. The days moved faster after that. My ticket was booked, my suit pressed, the coffee bar menu finalized. On the outside, it was just another trip for a family event. But in my head, every detail was a countdown. I didn't know exactly how the reveal would land, or how the night would shift afterward. But I knew one thing for sure. By the time it was over, no one in that room would ever look at me the same way again. The ballroom was already humming when I walked in, the kind of low, constant noise that came from too many conversations stacked on top of each other. Chandeliers caught the light from hundreds of candles, the air rich with the scent of roasted meat and gardenias. I moved through the crowd, offering polite nods, feeling the glances land on me like static. Ryan spotted me before I could get to my table. He was holding court near the bar with a group of his college buddies, most of them still in tuxedos that looked rented but well-pressed. He waved me over with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "This is my little brother Matt," he said to the group. "He runs a coffee business out in Oregon, so if you need caffeine to make it through tonight, he's your guy." The laugh that followed wasn't cruel exactly, but it wasn't friendly either. Before I could answer, Samantha slid into the circle, champagne flute in hand, her dress catching the light with every move. "Coffee's great for a break room buffet," she said, glancing at my glass. "But I think tonight calls for something a bit more elevated." Her friends laughed with that easy, unthinking agreement that comes when you're in the orbit of someone they've decided matters. I lifted my glass, gave them the smallest smile I could manage, and sipped. It was easier than letting the first words out of my mouth be the wrong ones. A couple of my cousins standing nearby chuckled quietly, the sound carrying just far enough for me to catch it. From across the room, I caught Pastor Mark watching. He was in conversation with a couple at the far end of the bar, but his eyes lingered a second too long on the scene before him. There was no judgment there, just the kind of curiosity that came from someone who already suspected there was more to the story. Dinner was served not long after. The tables were set in long rows, the centerpieces spilling over with roses and candles. I took a seat near the middle, flanked by an aunt who spent most of the meal talking about her new condo and a second cousin I barely knew. Ryan made a short toast about love and family, thanking the guests for being there. He didn't thank me, not even in passing. As dessert plates were cleared, I excused myself and made my way toward the coffee bar tucked into a corner of the room. The baristas I'd flown in were working smoothly, pulling shots, steaming milk, handing off drinks with practiced smiles. A few guests stopped by out of curiosity, complimenting the rich aroma. None of them knew I'd personally chosen the blend or paid for the service. When I turned back toward the main floor, I saw Samantha at another table leaning in toward a group of women. They were laughing again, and though I couldn't hear the words, I recognized the look she gave me when she caught sight of me watching. It was the same look she'd given me at the engagement party, the same one she'd worn when Ryan turned down my business proposal years earlier. Olivia appeared at my side, handing me a cup. She didn't say anything right away, just stood with me and looked out over the room. "You're doing better than I would in your shoes," she finally murmured. I told her I'd had a lot of practice. The night kept moving, the band starting up again, couples filling the dance floor. I stayed on the edges watching. Every so often, Pastor Mark's eyes would find mine, a subtle acknowledgement passing between us. Whatever was going to happen, it was coming closer. I could feel it in the way the air seemed to shift, in the weight of the unspoken things hanging just above the surface. I didn't need to force anything. The night would take care of the rest. I spotted Evelyn Harper near the service hallway. Her notepad clutched casually in one hand, like it was an accessory. She was laughing at something Grace had said, but even from across the room I could tell it was the kind of laugh that masked calculation. Evelyn had that reporter's knack for looking engaged while her mind was already 3 steps ahead. I didn't think much of it until I saw a catering server lean in and whisper something to Grace. Grace's eyes flicked quickly toward me before she caught herself, and when she turned back, Evelyn's expression had sharpened. I could almost see the wheels turning in her head. I tried to slip back toward my table, but Evelyn intercepted me halfway, her smile warm enough to disarm most people. "I hear you've been busy out west," she said, like we were picking up a conversation we'd left off years ago. "Business must be going well?" "It's steady," I told her, keeping my tone even. She didn't break eye contact, letting the silence stretch just long enough for me to feel its weight. Then she tilted her head slightly. "You know, Grace was telling me earlier how lucky Ryan and Samantha were to have everything come together so perfectly. And in a market like Austin, with venues booked years in advance, that's no small feat." I just smiled, the same polite, non-committal curve of the lips I'd used all night. She watched me for a beat longer before shifting her glass to her other hand. "You've always been good at keeping your cards close," she said quietly. "But you know how it is. Secrets have a way of finding daylight." Olivia appeared then, sliding into the space between us like she'd been watching from the sidelines. "Evelyn," she said warmly, "I heard you've been traveling for work. You'll have to tell me about that assignment in New Orleans." It was enough to redirect her, at least for the moment. Evelyn excused herself a few minutes later, weaving through the crowd with her phone in hand. I caught a glimpse of her screen as she passed a waiter. She was already typing something, a half-formed message to someone saved as City Desk. I found a spot by the coffee bar again, pretending to check my phone while I kept her in the corner of my eye. She drifted from table to table, smiling, laughing, asking questions that sounded casual but weren't. Grace approached me quietly about 20 minutes later, her brow furrowed. "I think Evelyn overheard more than she should have," she whispered. "I'm sorry, Matt. One of the servers let something slip and, well, she's good at pulling threads." I told her not to worry, but I could feel the tension tightening across my shoulders. Evelyn wasn't malicious, not exactly, but she thrived on stories with teeth, and I was starting to realize she thought she'd found one. The band had started another set, and most of the guests were on the dance floor. Evelyn wasn't among them. I watched her step outside onto the patio, phone to her ear, paying in short, deliberate lines. Olivia returned with 2 cups of coffee, pressing one into my hand. "She's going to push, you know," she said. "You'll have to decide if you want to get ahead of it or let it play out." I told her I'd made my choice weeks ago. All that was left now was to see whether the night would unravel in my favor or someone else's. I was refilling my coffee when I caught the ripple of tension moving through the room. It started at a corner table near the dessert spread where 2 guests were chatting with a young catering server. She was smiling, explaining something animatedly, and then I saw Samantha's head snap toward them like a hawk spotting movement in the grass. She was on her feet in an instant, crossing the space with that too smooth smile she wore when she wanted to keep an audience calm. She slipped an arm around the server's shoulder, steering her toward the side door that led to the service hallway. From my spot by the bar, I could see her mouth moving low and quick, the smile fading. The server's eyes went wide and she nodded so fast it almost looked like she was shivering. Samantha's hand tightened briefly on her arm before she let go. If you saw it from across the room, you'd think it was affectionate. Up close, it was the kind of grip that left an impression. The girl disappeared into the kitchen and Samantha smoothed her dress like nothing had happened. Grace appeared seconds later, slipping through the crowd with that crisis control walk I'd seen from her before. She intercepted Samantha near the edge of the dance floor, leaning in just enough to speak without being overheard. Whatever she said, Samantha's eyes narrowed, but she didn't argue. Meanwhile, at the far end of the room, Pastor Mark was leaning against a column, arms crossed, loosely, gaze drifting between Grace and me. He had that look, thoughtful but with a glint of recognition. Like he'd just pieced together a puzzle he hadn't realized he was solving. Evelyn, of course, was watching all of this from a table by the window. She had her phone out, not to call anyone this time, but with the Notes app open. Her fingers tapped quickly, pausing only when her eyes flicked toward me. There was a question in that glance, but also a certainty. She thought she knew. Olivia came to stand beside me, following my line of sight. "Samantha's not going to let this go if she thinks someone might outshine her tonight," she said under her breath. I kept my eyes on the floor-to-ceiling windows where the reflection of the room danced in the glass. It wasn't my job to stop Evelyn. It wasn't my job to reassure Grace or the catering staff. All I had to do was stand still and let the night move toward where it was always headed. A little later, I passed by the kitchen doors and caught a glimpse of the young server sitting on an upturned milk crate, head bowed, phone in her hands. One of her co-workers crouched beside her, speaking quietly. She glanced up at me as I walked by, eyes flicking away almost immediately. I didn't say anything. It wasn't the moment. Back in the main room, the band was playing something slow, couples filling the dance floor. Samantha was there with Ryan, smiling for the crowd, her hand resting on his shoulder, like she'd been born in the spotlight. But I could see the tightness in her jaw, the way her gaze kept sweeping the room looking for trouble before it could find her. Pastor Mark caught my eye again and gave the smallest nod as if to say, "I see it now." I wasn't sure if that meant comfort or complication. I found my seat and let the music wash over me, the conversations blending into a low hum. The evening was shifting in ways only a few of us could feel. Something had been set in motion, and the next turn was coming whether any of us were ready or not. Pastor Mark stepped up to the microphone with the easy grace of someone who had done this hundreds of times. The chatter in the room softened, then faded completely as the band lowered the volume. The clink of a fork on a plate rang louder than it should have. He smiled warmly at the crowd, speaking first about love and commitment, weaving in light humor that earned polite laughter. Then his tone shifted, a measured pause before his eyes swept the room. Tonight, he said, none of this would have been possible without the generosity of someone who cared enough to make it happen. There was a ripple through the guests. People glanced at one another, eyebrows lifting. Ryan's smile froze slightly and Samantha's hand tightened on his arm. Mark continued, his voice calm, but carrying easily across the room. The flowers you see, the incredible meal, the music filling the air, even this beautiful venue. All of it was made possible by one person here tonight. A murmur rose, quiet but insistent, like the room itself leaning forward to listen. I felt the weight of eyes searching the crowd, some looking for Grace, some for a wealthy family friend they might have missed. I stayed still in my seat. Mark's gaze landed on me. "Would you stand, Matthew?" The sound of my name hit like a dropped glass. I rose slowly, my chair scraping softly against the floor. Every head turned in unison, eyes wide, conversations dying mid-sentence. "This man," Mark said, his voice warm but unyielding, gave from his heart so that Ryan and Samantha could have the day they dreamed of. "Every detail you've enjoyed tonight is here, because Matthew Carter made it possible." Silence. Not the polite kind, but the kind that swallows the air, where even a cough would feel too loud. My heartbeat was steady, my hands relaxed at my sides. Ryan's mouth opened, then closed again. Samantha's face was perfectly composed, but the flush creeping up her neck betrayed her. Across the room, my father stared down into his wine while my mother's eyes glistened as she looked at me. A few guests began to clap, hesitant at first, then louder as others joined in. The sound echoed off the high ceilings. I gave a small nod, neither inviting the attention nor rejecting it. Evelyn's phone was in her hand, her thumb moving quickly. Grace stood near the band, watching with a soul-relieved smile. Olivia caught my eye and gave the faintest tilt of her head, a silent, "You did it." When the applause faded, Mark gestured for me to sit, and the room seemed to exhale all at once. But the air was different now, heavier in some places, lighter in others. Whispers buzzed at every table, eyes darted toward me and away again. Ryan raised his glass toward me. His smile stretched too tight. "Thanks, Matt," he said, his voice carrying just enough for nearby tables to hear. "Didn't know you had it in you." I met his gaze, held it for a beat, then lifted my own glass in return. "You'd be surprised what people have in them," I said, and took a slow sip. From that moment on, nothing in the room felt the same. Ryan's chair scraped back as he stood, the stem of his champagne flute trembling slightly between his fingers. He let out a tight laugh that sounded more like a cough, glancing at the nearest table as if searching for an ally. "Matthew helped with a small part of tonight," he said, his tone casual. Rehearsed as if a lighter version of the truth could undo what Mark had just cemented in everyone's mind. Pastor Mark didn't even hesitate. His smile stayed fixed, but his voice cut clean through the murmurs. "No, Ryan, it was all of it. Every last detail." The room went quiet again, sharper this time. Ryan's face twitched, and for a second I thought he might argue, but Samantha's manicured hand gripped his arm. She was smiling, but it was the kind of smile that belonged in glossy photographs, not here. The flush on her cheeks was no longer the kind that could be explained by champagne. Aunt Carol was the first to move. She rose from her seat, her expression soft but weighted with something like guilt. She reached for my hands and gave them a squeeze. "I didn't know, Matt. I swear." Her voice wavered, and I nodded, letting her off the hook without words. Others followed. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, old neighbors who'd known me as the awkward teenager who worked summers stocking shelves, friends of my parents, who'd always measured success in titles and square footage. One after another, they offered apologies wrapped in surprise, shame, and a little curiosity. I answered each one the same way. A small nod, a calm look in the eye, no resentment. That seemed to unsettle them more than anger ever could. From the corner of the room I saw Evelyn Harper. She was leaning back in her chair, phone in hand, the glow of the screen lighting up a smile that belonged to someone who had just found her lead story. Our eyes met briefly, and she didn't bother pretending she wasn't working. Helen found me in the middle of another conversation. She didn't speak at first, just wrapped her arms around me the way she used to when I was a kid. Her cheek pressed against my shoulder. I felt the weight of everything she'd never said about the years between us. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet, but her smile was genuine. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, and I believed her. My father was harder to read. William stayed seated, his posture rigid, staring into the deep red of his wine as though the answer to some private question might be there. He didn't look up when I passed by, and I didn't slow down. Ryan and Samantha made their way over eventually. He was trying too hard, the grin stretched thin, the handshake just a little too firm. "That was incredible, Matt, really. You didn't have to do all that." His voice was light, but the stiffness in his shoulders betrayed him. Samantha's thank you was even tighter. She added something about how she wished she'd known, so they could have acknowledged it sooner. But her eyes were scanning the room, tracking every gaze, every whisper. I let them both talk, offering nothing more than a polite smile. They left a few moments later, retreating toward a group of Samantha's friends who closed ranks around her. As the band started a slower set, the air in the room began to shift again. Conversations picked up, but they weren't about travel plans or business deals anymore. I caught my name drifting from table to table, sometimes in admiration, sometimes in confusion. It wasn't about vindication for me. It was about watching the story they'd written in their heads collapse under the weight of the truth. And judging by the way they kept glancing over, some part of them was still trying to figure out what to do with the new version of me they'd just met. The music shifted into something sifter, the kind of melody that filled the gaps between conversations without demanding attention. I made my way toward the far corner of the reception hall, where Olivia was already seated with a plate of cake in front of her. Tommy was next to her, leaning back in his chair, sipping coffee from one of the maple and sage mugs I had brought in just for tonight. Pastor Mark joined us a moment later, carrying his own cup like he'd been waiting for the right time to claim one. I sat down, feeling the tension I'd been carrying all evening start to slip away. Olivia gave me a look, equal parts pride and relief. "You handled that perfectly," she said, her voice low. Tommy grinned, raising his mug in a silent toast. "Best coffee I've ever had at a wedding," he added, and for the first time all night I laughed without holding back. From our table I could still see Ryan making his rounds. His smile was tighter now, his movements more deliberate, like each conversation was an attempt to reclaim something he'd lost. Samantha stayed closer to the dance floor, her posture straighter than usual, her laugh ringing a little too loud when she talked to her friends. The ease she'd worn like armor earlier in the evening was gone, replaced by an alertness that said she knew exactly how quickly people could change their minds. Mark set his cup down and leaned toward me. "I hope you know," he said, "that I didn't do that to embarrass them." I nodded. "I know. You told the truth. That's all." He smiled at that as if it was the simplest thing in the world. A few guests approached our table throughout the night, some curious, some offering awkward compliments, a few even asking about my business. It was strange watching people who had spent years dismissing me now, trying to find common ground. I didn't feel the need to make it easy for them, but I also didn't shut the door, let them sit with it for a while. The band began its final set, couples slowly filling the dance floor. I stayed seated, content to watch. The glow from the string lights above reflected in Olivia's hair, in the coffee cups, in the polished wood of the tables. I took a slow sip, letting the rich taste settle on my tongue, and glanced around the room. A few of the same eyes that had looked me up and down when I first arrived were on me again now. But the judgment in them had shifted into something else, something they weren't ready to name. It was the same mix of uncertainty and self-consciousness I'd felt so many times before, only this time it didn't touch me. Olivia caught my gaze and tilted her head toward the door. "You ready?" I looked around one last time, letting the moment fix itself in my memory. They had mocked me because they thought I was small, because they thought they knew the limits of my life. But tonight had shown them that respect can't be bought with assumptions or status, only earned through truth. As we stepped outside into the cool night air, the faint sound of music trailing behind us, I felt something close, a weight lift, a chapter turn. Don't ever underestimate someone just because you think you know their story.